extend a heartfelt welcome to all the speakers, our moderators, and the audience. I'm very happy to have this panel in front of me, and we've been planning this. We've been in conversation for some time now, and to actually have you here on the D Day, I'm very happy that everything sort of we've navigated our paths through this whole entire course. And the topic is extremely interesting. It's called Fostering Gender Equality and Women Empowerment, and the perspective is psychological. So allow me to introduce our panel today. um, we have Andrea, we have Anna, and we have Fernanda. Fernanda will be we'll start with Andrea first. Andrea is a seasoned professional who specializes in assisting clients coping with depression, anxiety, offering them empathetic and personalized support. She has been a pillar of strength for survivors of sexual abuse, guiding them through their healing journey with compassion and understanding. Her commitment to mental health extends beyond individual counseling as she actively champions the cause of mental well being as a mental health activist. She operates an informative platform that promotes mental health awareness and resources for those in need. With her targeted workshops, Andrea covers an array of essential topics such as building self esteem, navigating motherhood, healing from past experiences, and effectively managing anxiety and depression. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you for being here. And we next have Fernanda. Uh, she's a psychologist, um, uh, an activist against anti-fat bias, and offers a space for those who seek acceptance for their bodies in a very self-compassionate and introspective manner through her content, classes, workshops, and oh, I am so sorry. I think I mixed it up. This was about Anna. I'm so sorry. I don't know why this mix-up is happening. Uh,
Don't
apol-
worry.
Apologies. Please allow me to restart. Uh, okay, I have a very interesting panel because the three of you are psychologists, so it's sort of mixed up in my brain. Forgive me. Anna is a psychologist and an activist against anti-fat bias, and she offers a safe space for those who are seeking to accept their bodies in a self-compassionate and introspective manner through her content, classes, workshops, and consultations. With her commitment to self acceptance and social change, she's an inspiring leader in the world of wellness and body liberation. Once again, I am very apologetic, but welcome you with a very big heart. Thank you so much for being here. And finally, we have Fernanda. Fernanda is also a psychologist, sex educator, and specialized in narrative practices with a focus on gender based violence prevention and intervention. She works with individuals who experience or perpetrate various forms of violence, be it psychological, sexual, physical, economic, etc. In addition to her clinical work, she serves as a gender consultant in both the public and private sectors, collaborating with civil society and state, federal, and foreign governments on projects related to stalking prevention, particularly in terms of classification, awareness raising, and victim support. She also provides assistance to victims of different forms of violence. Thank you so much, Fernanda, for being here. Uh, so the topic is a very relevant topic under the gender equality and women empowerment theme. We tend to have a lot of conversations regarding this theme, but to view it from a psychological perspective will be something that is really fresh, at least for this summit, because we've not had this kind of a discussion as of now. And thank you so much for bringing this perspective in. The floor is yours. Please let me know if you need any technical assistance. I'm here, but you may please carry on.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you so much for this invitation. We are pleased to be here. We know that it's something new to have a psychological perspective on this subject. So it was really important for us to also talk about some issues that are not really talked about so much when we talk about gender violence. So I'm gonna start by sharing my presentation. I want to talk a little bit about gender violence in a new way, maybe for all of you. Please let me know if you can see my screen. Yes, okay, perfect. So I want to start talking about gender-based violence in a different way, because when we hear about gender violence, we sometimes think about this very aggressive type of violence, right? We think about physical violence. So that's a little exercise I want to start with. What do you think of when I say violence? Maybe you think of a girl in an alley being beaten, right? Maybe you think about a woman that is being physically assaulted by her partner. Maybe we think about sexual assault. What are we thinking when we say violence, gender based violence? And that's really important because that's the narrative we are building in a society, right? So I wanna talk about gender violence in a different way. I want you all to understand that there's different types of violence. When we think about colors, when I say color, a color, maybe you think about your favorite color, maybe you think about a color that you are looking at, but we know that there's a lot of colors out there, right? And it's important when we talk about violence to understand and be able to name all the different types of violence that women are living in different societies. Because if we don't um recognize those different types of violence, then it's going to be hard for us to be able to do something about it, to change, right? To do political differences in our communities, to do different approaches in education. So it is very important to understand where is all of this violence coming from, how can we name it, how can we understand it, and then when we understand it, how can we approach it to make a difference? So I'm gonna give you a little context. In Mexico, 70% of women age 15 and older have experienced at least one situation of violence throughout their lives. So this is very important, right? We are living violence in different communities, in different forms, in different spaces. Violence is not something that we live only at home or only when we go out to the streets. Violence is something that we live in all spaces because violence is in our system, right? We live in a patriarchal system that was made by men with men's perspective, men's needs. So that lack of woman perspective, woman needs has had repercussions uh, when we get out to those spaces, right? So if we talk about history, before women were only allowed in some spaces, maybe in their homes, maybe in the markets, maybe in the church, right? So maybe violence was in those spaces. But now that we have come out to participate in lawmaking, now that we come out to participate in the workforce, now that we go out to public transportation, now that we're on the streets, we perceive gender-based violence in all spaces, right? And why is it that, for example, we see more gender based violence in the streets? Because those were spaces that were not for women, right? So, how can we teach someone that this is not your space? This is not a space for you. This is where I make the rules, right? So, when we go out to the streets, we are sexually harassed because that's a way of telling us this is my place. I can do whatever I want in this space. And then we go to the workplace, right? And it was before those were places for men. So now they had these dynamics, right? They had also violent dynamics. But what happens when women are um, entered when women enter into these spaces? Well, a way of saying this is my space, I have the power here, is by perpetrating gender violence in the workplace, right? So all of these changes in society make different or not make, but um, make us experience different types of violence that we maybe didn't recognize before, right? So it's very important for us to think about violence in a wider way, not just this physical violence that we often hear about in the news, in the papers, right? So I'm gonna tell you about some of the most common types of violence that we live in Mexico. With 51% is psychological violence, with which is almost always present when we see another type of violence, right? Because we think violence is something that is maybe gonna be experienced in the streets with a random person, but the truth is, um, women experience violence mostly from their close relatives, right? So in their homes, by their partners, or by their uncles, for example, it's really common, right? So we need to understand that in this um, engaging in the family, in our communities, that's where the violence is occurring. Also, 49% of women in Mexico experience sexual violence. There's also economical violence that is not very talked about and not really that recognizable for people in Mexico, but is really high. Um, and it's really problematic when we talk about, for example, women that live gender violence in their relationships, because that's one of the main reasons, and I have seen it in my practice. I don't know if you guys, you'll tell me about it later, but I've seen that that's one of the um, main definers of why women are staying in violent spaces, even if they don't want to. So sometimes we hear about this. Well, if you're living violence by your partner, why don't you leave that partner? Well, because sometimes they can't, right? Sometimes staying is their best option, and we need to understand that to be able to change and to give different types of support to women that are living gender-based violence. There's also symbolic violence. That is something that we don't really talk about, and that has to do with the education we have in Mexico, where even before we are born, people decide or have these expectations of who we are going to be, right? So, in sexual education, we like to name this the difference between sex and gender, right? So, sex is the body you are born in, and gender is what society expects from you because of that body that you have. So if you are born with this body, you're gonna be a girl. That means you're gonna be sensitive, you're gonna be skinny, you're gonna be pretty, you're gonna be um, really helpful, you're gonna want to be a mother, etc. If you're born a boy, if you have this body, you're a boy, then you're gonna love blue, you're gonna be masculine, you're gonna love sports, you're gonna have money and power and a lot of women around you, right? So that those expectations that are forced upon us even before we are born shape the way our society is built, and it shapes the way that we are built in our society, right? Because um, when we grow up, maybe we think, yes, this is who I am because i I know myself and I love pink, right? Or I love ballet, or I really want to be a mother, right? But we need to think about how many of these ideas of ourselves, of other people in our society, were forced upon us on this um, like really separated binary idea of women and men, right? When we can only see women by these feminine people who have this role in society, when we see women that we only value women but about by how they look and by how they can build this life that we think it's best for them, right? So having a husband, having a job maybe now, but not a job that is so demanding. When you get married to your husband, it can only be a husband, not a not a woman. And you need to step out of your job, take care of your kids, right? All these expectations that are forced upon us, but shape how we grow up in a society, right? Because if we grow up and we want to do certain things and we are constantly being punished or señalados, ¿cómo se dice? Pointed at or excluded for being different, right? Then of course we're gonna think the best for us is to go around that path, to not experience violence, to not experience discrimination, etc. So the same goes for men, right? They are taught that they need to be really powerful, that they need to be really sexual, that they need to be focused on their work, not on their families, that they cannot have emotions. Well, that also affects how they relate to women, how they relate to other men. So all of that is symbolic violence, right? How these ideas, how these ways of speaking, these narratives that we have about men and women are shaping us and are restricting us for having freedom in choosing who we want to be, who, how we are valuable to the society, etc. And Pau is gonna talk about that later. But it's very important for me to understand that that is called by some people call it otherwise, but today we're gonna talk about it as symbolic violence. Okay. We also have physical violence. We also have other types of violence. For example, right now we are fighting for getting stalking as a recognizable type of violence in Mexico, because in other countries it is recognizable, in Mexico it is not yet recognizable, and that leads to other types of violence being perpetrated in Mexico. There's a lot of types of violence that women are living in Mexico right now, and it is important for us to share with you to see if maybe in other parts of the world we have different names. For example, we have this vicarious violence, that is when in a relationship the father is using violence because the partner is not close physically. Then I'm gonna be violent to you by violenting our kids, right? Or by not letting you see our kids. So I'm gonna take them and I'm gonna use the system that benefits me as a man to stop you from seeing your kids, for example. So there's a lot of types of violence in Mexico that we are living, and we need to recognize them all. We need to name them all, and as professionals, especially mental health professionals, it is important to understand and name these types of violence so we can stop normalizing them. We can stop seeing them as something that is from our society and we can do nothing about it, right? Okay, perfect. So I also want to talk about power dynamics, which play a really powerful role in gender-based violence, right? When we talk about violence, we talk about power. We talk about controlling that other person, or like I said, showing them who is in charge. So in a society where we are built in institutions and with ideas that you have to win, you have to be the one in power, and you have to um, yeah, use your force, use your strength in order to be better, right? Because the only way to be better is by having control over other people. The only way to be happy is to have control or money over other people. That is when power dynamics enter, and that is really it has a really bad repercussion for our society, because power dynamics are happening all the time everywhere, right? For example, if we talk about relationships, we think, okay, it is normal to have power dynamics in our relationship, but what is not healthy is to have someone always in the power dynamic, like on top of that dynamic, right? So what are the problems of having power dynamics in our society? Unequal power distribution, reinforcement of stereotypes, manipulation and coercion, fear of repercussion, barriers to seeking help, um, power dynamics being reinforced by societal norms, and impediment of empowerment of the self, right? So, um, unequal power distribution. Why? Because it is clear that if you in Mexico we have really inequitable, um, it's a really, ¿cómo se dice? ¿Me ayudan? No sé cómo decirlo. Ay, las perdí.
¿Qué es lo que
¿Qué
quieres
es lo que
decir,
quieres
Fer?
traducir?
O sea, sociedades inequitativas, de que las clases sociales están mal distribuidas.
Unequitable societies,
Ujú.
¿no?
Sí.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so if the power is distributed unevenly between different areas, but also between genders, that's gonna favor men's dominance and control, right? And that power creates a fertile ground for abusive behaviors and for a dominant group to exploit their authority and control over marginal groups that are not only women, that could be different types of groups. Number two, reinforcement of stereotypes. Power dynamics reinforce and perpetuate harmful gender stereotypes that we talked about. And in societies where these roles lead to a sense of entitlement and superiority among those in dominant positions, these stereotypes can normalize behaviors and contribute to justification of violence against women and against other groups. Manipulation and coercion. Individuals in positions of power can manipulate or coerce those with less authority into submission, right? And we see it when we talk about law, when we talk about justice, and when we talk about gender-based violence. It is used when the abuser uses emotional manipulation, threats, economical control, and other tactics to maintain that control over the victim. And this dynamic is also creating a cycle of dependency that makes it hard for victims to free those spaces. Also, the fear of repercussion. We have rates of 90% of women in Mexico not going to the police when they are living gender-based violence, because these power dynamics are not only in our families, in our communities, they are also in the institutions that are supposed to be helping us, right? So the fear of facing those questions, to be victimized again, or facing social repercussion. We see a lot, and I see it in my consultation, that a lot of women don't want to tell their families what's happening, because they know, they don't fear, they know that they're gonna be guilt about the situation, and that or that they're not gonna be supported by them. Um, and those ideas and those traditional stereotypes that we haven't been able to change in our communities can perpetuate that cycle of violence again, right? So if you know that everyone around you is going to think it's your fault what's happening, of course you're also gonna think that. If everyone around you is gonna tell you that you deserve it, then of course you're gonna think you deserve it. Number 5, barriers of to seeking help. Like I said, the imbalance of power can create barriers for victims to seek help, and they can hesitate to report abuse because they know that the rates of justice are not gonna. They understand that the law is probably not gonna help them, and it's gonna be a process that is gonna be even harder for them, right? So if it's gonna affect you even more to seek justice and seek help, then a lot of women decide not to. Number 6, reinforce power dynamics reinforced by societal norms. Those societal norms often support and reinforce existing power dynamics um, about gender roles, authority, relationships, and they influence how people perceive and respond to gender based violence. So we need to change the understanding of gender based violence so we can have a different response for victims and for people who are in these communities where we see more normalized types of gender based violence. And number 7, impediment of empowerment. So if we have these power dynamics, it's gonna be harder for that individual or those communities to to be able to find their own abilities, their own tools to get power of themselves back, right? So if we're talking about communities that have lived other types of violence, other types of power dynamics, for example, indigenous communities, for example, Black communities, then of course, if you add another type of power dynamic to that community, it's going to be harder to escalate all these yeah, different types of power dynamics that are existing, right? um, and when we talk about power dynamics and we talk about different communities in Mexico and how diverse it is, we need to talk about intersection, and that is understanding that these power dynamics um, exist not only in gender, right? So they exist in race, they exist in ethnicity, they exist by your sexual orientation. So people that, for example, women who have relationships with women, they live different types of power dynamics also. Trans women, gender identity also is another power dynamic. So trans women also face different types of violence, not only gender violence, right? Um, indigenous women face other types of violence, not only gender violence. Black women in Mexico face different types of violence, right? So when we talk about gender violence, we cannot forget that while this type of violence or these types of violence are going on, there's other types of violence that are also taking place at the same time and that are working sometimes together for that person or that community. So we need to understand that gender-based violence doesn't look the same in, for example, us that are white women in Mexico City, or if we talk about someone in the north of Mexico, or if we talk about a trans woman in a small community, or if we talk about a Black woman in Mexico, right? So it is very important to understand that there's a lot of different types of violence working in the system that are that we need to recognize so we can attend gender violence. That is something that didn't we in Mexico we didn't see before, we didn't talk about before, right? We thought feminism and women empowerment was the only fight we had to be fighting, but we need to be aware of all the other dynamics that get into place, right? And not place just gender violence as the only thing we need to attend. And getting into one of like, where does this gender-based violence comes from? We talked about before that it comes from different spaces, all spaces, but in this change in society where women have taken a more active role in different spaces, one place that has changed a lot is the household, right? So women are experiencing more and more violence in their relationships, especially heterosexual women in their relationships, because of these changes of power in the dynamics, right? So before, we could think about these social norms that were established and no one would question. Maybe some people would, but not a lot of people would question that the woman had to stay at home, be with their kids, etc. Then maybe when women started going to work, then okay, you can go to work, but you're the main person responsible for the home, for the husband's well-being and happiness, for the household, for the kids, etc. Now, with all this change in social norms, in social understanding, in social dynamics, in gender in general, and questioning these binary ideas of gender, everything changed in relationships. So we have seen this resistance, right? This resistance from families, this resistance from partners, of understanding that the value of woman and the role of women in the society has changed also. So that is what we call um, violent relationships, or the cycle of violence. This resisting of change, this resisting of women taking a different role in society. So I'm gonna really fast talk about what is the cycle of violence, and is a recurrent pattern that characterizes many abusive relationships, that starts with the honeymoon phase, where everything is great and the couple is really in love, etc. Then we have the tension building phase. That is this phase where we want this relationship to be like at the beginning, but this tension is starting to build. And then we have the phase of the explosion, where the abuser presents this conduct of violence that can be screaming, can be um, maybe hitting, it can be psychological violence. But the thing about the cycle of violence, it is that it is always it's a cycle, so it's always going back until we get to the honeymoon phase and we start again. Why? Because after the explosion, the couple wants everything to go back to normal, right? So they both make an effort. Maybe the perpetrator even feels sorry, says, sorry, that's not going to happen again. I feel really bad. That's not me. I don't know what happened to me. And they both start to connect again and try their best efforts to, get that connection again and get back to the beginning. But that can not last forever, so we're getting back to the tension building phase, and then the explosion. And what happens with violence, and that's something I wanted to talk about because I haven't seen this in any other country, is a violentometro. That is a measure of violence. Here in Mexico, we use this to understand that what I said before, violence is something that is always going to go up. Why? Because violence is control. So if I saw that I cannot control you with psychological violence or with screaming, and then next time I'm gonna have a more violent conduct, right? So I just wanted to share this violentometro with you, because it has really helped psychologists, educators, mental health people in general to guide our consultants in understanding what gender or violence in general is, and how it can only go up if we don't put an end to it, if we don't name it, and if we don't try to change it, right? So how can we get involved? What can we do as people that are understanding now all the different types of violence, that we are able to understand, well, that social norm, or that type of relationship, that conduct can lead to a higher level of violence, not because there's like more important or more like all violence is critical, all violence should be pointed and named and attended, but there we can do a prevention if we start from the beginning. If we can start in the yellow colors, then we can stop it from going further. So how can we get involved? By not letting these social norms, these power dynamics, get to violence, get to a place where it is normalized and it is understood that that is their problem as a couple, right? When we can name it, we can understand it, and we can put a stop before it is too late, before it gets too bad. Um, Something that I love to do is, for example, if we're talking about violence that we see on the street, we have the 5Ds of Holabach that talk about not being part of the problem, right? Not being part of not doing anything, staying on the side of positioning ourselves on the side of doing something about it. We don't have to get involved and put our lives at risk, but we can do something. We can name the violence. We can distract the person who is doing that violent conduct. We can ask for help. We can do a lot of things, but never be normal against violence. Never do nothing against violence. And how do we support survivors and create spaces for disclosure and healing? First, it is to understand that, for example, when we talk about the cycle of violence, most people don't want to talk about what they're living because they know they're going to be put on the light. They're going to be guilt into thinking, well, this is my fault. I am letting this happen to me, right? So it is very important to be a support, to have a network of support always when we have relationships, even when we have been married for a lot of years. Always have a support net that is always gonna help us if we're in a difficult situation, right? So if we have a network of different people from different places, from work, from our community, from our school, from our family, someone that we can talk about this subject. And if you are someone that is being approached by someone you love, telling you, I am living this is happening to me, it is very important to listen and to not tell the person what you need. You need this, you should do this, you should get out of there, you should come with me, you should value yourself. No, we need to be empathetic, we need to listen, and we need to ask, what do you need of me? How can I help? How can I be an emotional support? How can I be there for you even if you are still in that situation? How can I help you without getting myself in danger, of course? And how do we evolution in this time of globalization and social media? Because before, social changes were slower, right? But now we have uh, information, whatever information we have right now. So societies are changing fast, and we have generations that are changing and changing and understanding um, differently how society works, how gender works. But we also have generations that are like staying in how they were taught a long time ago, and something that has worked for them for a long time. So it's hard to get together and get to a mutual point if we are not standing in a position of respect, of understanding different perspectives, right? Because with social media, you also get what you are looking for, right? The algorithm shows you only uh, what you like, how you think, people you like, people that think like you. So it is really important to expose ourselves to different understandings of the world, so that we can think about needs of people beyond ourselves, needs of people that have different situations than us, that have different power dynamics or different types of violence happening, right? So it is very important to always, when we talk about gender violence, understand that we are all part of the solution, we are all part of the change, but we have to commit ourselves, because this affects us, right? In Mexico, we have rates of men, um, um, ¿cómo se dice? Higher rates of suicide in men than in women. That tells us about this problem. This system is affecting everyone in society, not only women. So we first need to understand that, so we know that we all need to be part of the solution. And how do we become part of the solution? First, we talked about attention. How can we be there for people? How can we, as psychologists, for example, understand all this system and all these power dynamics that happen around us to give a better system? But also, we need to attend the prevention part, right? So we need to, first of all, men need to step in, right, in gender-based violence, because we are all part of the solution, not of the problem also, but we're all part of the solution, and that is very important. We need men to get in the conversation, because we cannot just have society separated in two and talk about feminism with women, and men just not understanding what is going on, not understanding all the social change, not understanding of this change of power dynamics that we are living, right? So I think it is very important to make space for men in this conversation, and also for men to step in and take responsibility for their place in the solution, building different spaces for men to question their masculinity, how they were raised, and how that affects themselves, and also how that affects women and other people in their communities. And of course, and I always say this, sexual education is core for changing gender-based violence. We need to, and when I say about sexual education, I do not mean sexuality as sex, having sexual relationships. Sexuality is who we are, is how we perceive the world, how we identify ourselves, how do we relate to each other, how do we live in a historic time and place, and how that shapes us, right? So we need to talk about consent when we talk about sexual education. We need to talk about diversity when we talk about sexual education, respecting diversity, understanding that everyone is different, and everyone deserves respect, and everyone is welcome in different spaces, and healthy relationships, of course, because if all of this is happening and all of this is changing, and we have people um, getting into relationships without questioning how the society is changed, and how the power dynamics have changed, and how women and men of all types, really different, are stepping in different spaces, um, that is something that we need to question again. How were we taught to relate with one another, and how can we change that? So I'm gonna take back this presentation. I'm gonna give the microphone to Ana Pau, and I wanna is Ana Pau here, because she's going to talk about a really important subject that we sometimes do not see, and that it affects women and girls in all areas in society.
So I'm going to talk about briefly about fat phobia and the way it impacts gender violence and gender-based violence. And I just want to start saying by saying that I'm going to use the word fat many times during my conversation, because fat is just a descriptor of bodies, and it is not a foul word or a bad word. It's just a descriptor. So starting with what is fat phobia, I have some notes. That's why I'm looking down. And fat phobia is a belief system that is based on the hate and discrimination of fat people for the simple fact of being fat. So of course, it is always based on the idea that it is because of health and because we are worried about their health. But as we have seen and as we have studied as activists, we have realized that it has nothing to do with health, and it has everything to do with just the hatred and discrimination of fat people. So something that is very important for me to disclose is that fat phobia and aesthetic violence is not the same. So we have beauty standards, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But fat phobia is something different. Fat phobia is a system of oppression, is a system of discrimination, such as racism or homophobia or transphobia or all of those. And the difference is that aesthetic violence has more impact on women and femme presenting individuals, and it is stemming from racism and anti fat bias and all these, and ageism and all these systems of oppression and of discrimination, but it's not the same as fat phobia. So that is different. Actually, aesthetic violence and beauty standards come from fat phobia in a way. And what is the way that this impacts mostly women, but also impacts every fat person out there? Well, eating disorders are well more prevalent in women and also young people. Eating disorders are not stopping. Eating disorders are worsening and worsening. And even though there are campaigns and there are different efforts to reduce the impact of eating disorders, they are out there. And this is because if we do not talk about fat phobia, we are not talking about one of the most important parts of why eating disorders are out there. And the first reason why eating disorders appear are diets. Dieting is the most important predictor of an eating disorder, and diets exist because we don't want to be fat, because we hate fat people. So that is very, very important for me to say. Also, employment. Fat people have a harder time finding employment. There was a poll made, and there was a questionnaire answered in Mexico this year, last year, sorry, 2022, about discrimination. And most people said that they were discriminated against at employment places because of their size. So the size of a person will predict how much they will earn. And of course, if we are talking that there's a difference in how much a woman earns, if fat phobia is active, it will be way worse. Because of course, fat phobia again intersects with beauty standards, and then they are applied more harshly to women. Also, we have access to clothing. Clothing is expensive and clothing is hard to find. And for fat people, this is almost impossible. Depending on the size you are, it can become something that you have to have made at your size. We can only buy clothes online, and that makes it even harder to have ethically sourced clothing, and that makes it really, really hard to be part of positive change when it comes to clothing industries. And finally, there's access to healthcare. We know that women have a harder time when accessing healthcare because studies are not made with women bodies in mind, and there is not a lot of research about that. But also, being a fat person, doesn't matter your gender, will make it harder for you to access healthcare because weight stigma is really, really prevalent in healthcare systems. So there's a lot of stories of people who don't get their diagnosis correctly, and they die of diseases, cancer, and different things because they are told to lose weight every time they visit a healthcare professional. So healthcare is a very hard thing for people to find, even in psychological spaces. When it comes to mental health, a lot of people in fat bodies are suffering from anxiety, from violence, from different things. And when they go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they are told to lose weight to be able to deal with violence. So this is another way in which Fernanda was talking about conforming to violence to or not conforming to norms to avoid violence, and this is another way in which we see that healthcare professionals ask for their patients to conform to norms to avoid violence, and that is just terrible and has not worked. There's more fat people in the world ever since the war against obesity started. I don't use that word, but ever since that war began on the 90s, we haven't really reduced the amount of fat people in the world. And some people ask how is fat phobia and gender norms correlated, and what I would say is that both things contribute to gender to no, I'm sorry. Fat phobia and gender norms both contribute to beauty standards. So the way beauty standards are established, as I was saying, is we add a little bit of gender norms, a little bit of fat phobia, a little bit of racism, a little bit of um, ableism, a little bit of ageism. No, all these systems of oppression are added into a pot, and then we create beauty standards. So beauty standards are just a manifestation of every other belief system that our society has. And so, talking about beauty standards alone without talking about all these systems of oppression makes no sense. There's no way that we're going to get rid of those beauty standards if we don't get rid of those systems of oppression. So, again, talking about what Fernanda was saying about conforming to the norms to avoid violence, I was thinking when you were saying that about Naomi Wolf's Beauty Myth, this book. And there's something that she says that is very important to me and that I talk about a lot in with my students and my consultants. And this is that she says that it's quite impossible almost for women and for people in general to not adjust to beauty norms, because we may lose our community, our belonging to a community, our identity, or our livelihood, so our job. And this is very, very true. When you talk to a group of women or a group of femme presenting individuals and you tell them you don't have to conform to these beauty norms. Okay, yes, but if I don't conform to the beauty norms, then I might lose my job, or I might lose my identity as a woman, or I might lose my sense of community, right? So it's very hard to ask this of people, and that's why we have to to constantly work on dismantling these systems of oppression, and as healthcare professionals even more. But we have to be very conscious of this. We have to work on systems of oppression, and as long as women and femme presenting individuals are viewed as objects, and systems of oppression survive, we won't be able to reduce these beauty standards that also impact eating disorders and other behaviors that are at risk. And then finally, what can we do? What can we do to help this? And first of all, I would say we have to lose our idea of a default human. Adolphe Quetelet, who was the creator of the BMI, which we now know doesn't work for that, and it was not created. The BMI was not created for health purposes, and he wrote this idea of l'homme moyen, which in French means the average man. No, a man as in gendered, the average man. And he was saying, what's the average human? What size does he have? What color does he have? What gender? He's a he, right? So all these things, that was the average man. And I think that our heads still think like that. Like there's an average human, and all of the other things are deviations. So the average human is a man, is tall, is European, white, is heterosexual, cisgender, all these things that make the average man, and all the other things are deviations. And even our workplace works like that. Women don't have extra off days when they're in their periods. We have to adjust in maternity leaves if they exist. We have to adjust to what men do and act almost as men, because the man is the default human. So we have to start thinking that there's no default human. There's no default human, and we have to listen and learn to marginalize people. The past few days, there has been something in Mexico with influencers. We're not going to talk about that very, very deeply. But what I learned about this is we need to listen to marginalized groups, because it's very, very hard to lose power. And Fernanda was talking a lot about power, but we don't see there's some power that we don't see in whiteness, in and cisgendering, and we have to listen to marginalized people to learn and not assume what they need or how we need to do it. And that's why I'm very thankful to be invited here as a fat person, but I can only talk for fat people like me, because there's a lot of fat people, disabled fat people, black fat people. And finally, ask questions. We very much assume what a person will need, and we don't ask if that's okay. Even when we do public policy, a lot of times people in marginalized groups are not invited to the conversation, and people with disabilities have this saying that is, nothing about us without us. And that means not, we don't have to do policy and take decisions without people being considered in those decisions. So that's what I would say. Let's make diverse groups and go out of our way to include people that are different than us, to create a more diverse world and make a collective understanding of how this world should be. So that's my talk for today. Thank you so much, Fernanda.
And I want to talk about this that you just said, because I was thinking about it yesterday, reflecting on all that we've learned um, the last few days, and I was thinking that this space should have other people involved that are
Mm-hmm.
not white cis women, right? Um, but because like I just thought about it, like I thought of people that I knew that talked about this subject, and you are people that I know that talk about these subjects, people that um, I was born in the same spaces with, that we like, maybe we didn't know from childhood, but we moved in those places, right?
Mm-hmm.
Together. And now with social media, we have a greater understanding that that is not all that there is out there. There are different groups, there's marginalized groups, and there's groups that are living the same violence that we're living, plus other types of violence in their workplace, in their schools, in their communities. And yeah, that is for the next panel. It would be really interesting to see a different perspective than what we have to offer today. But yeah, I think that's really important what you said. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And Andrea, it's your turn. We wanted to talk about mental health. As psychologists, we are battling all these power dynamics, these system dynamics, and violence. Um, and we wanted to understand how is this affecting women differently than men. Um, yeah, how can we understand mental health with gender violence, and what can we do to support people that are struggling?
Okay. Let's start by saying, well, first, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let's start by saying that mental health problems obviously affect both men and women, but not in equal measure. I'm going to start by saying some statistics and then we'll get into it. According to a comparative study between a variety of countries made by the World Health Organization, twice as many women as men have experienced depression. This was very much supported by another study made by the American Psychiatric Association that stated that women were 1.5 to 3% more likely to experience depression than men. In Mexico, numbers are 15.3% in women have reported to having depressions at least once in their lifetime versus 5.1% in men. The anxiety statistics, on the other hand, are very similar to depression, with the general finding that it also tends to be twice as likely for women to report having anxiety diagnosis versus men. The lifetime prevalence for generalized anxiety in the US is higher in women, 6.6 versus 3.6 in women than in men. This supports also the previous finding about the twice likelihood of women having depression and anxiety. Women were also found to be more likely to ruminate or heavily and adversely focus on negative emotions, thoughts, and symptoms of distress, and this associates with higher rates of anxiety and depression. Women were also more likely than men to have comorbidity between anxiety disorders, bulimia, depression, and more suicide attempts. Men, on the other hand, had higher rates of alcohol, substance abuse, and suicide. So women had more attempts of suicide, but men had more numbers in suicides. And women also have higher rates of suicide ideation. But let's get into that a little bit later. Before continuing with more statistics, it is imperative to mention that these findings also answer to a social phenomenon. Women are much more likely to seek help and communicate their needs to peers and medical personnel. Women are much more socialized into, and it is much more accepted and normalized to be expected of them to communicate their needs, emotions, and feelings. Due to these factors, men are less likely to identify that they may experience some kind of mental distress and less likely to communicate their symptoms. As a result, all the numbers I mentioned before and the real numbers for men and their mental health diagnosis aren't as clear. So, continuing from the fact that women so far have higher rates of diagnosis for depression and anxiety, I think it's very important to understand why this might be. Research shows and indicates that biological factors, inherent traits, personal life circumstances, and experiences may be of great influence, as we already hear from Ana Pau and Fernanda. No? So we can start relating all the previous information that we heard from you. Factors specifically that increase the risk of depression in women. I want to talk to you guys after I'm done with the exposition about this, because I found it very interesting. The factors specifically related to depression include hormonal imbalances, puberty, which encompasses conflict with parents, increased pressure over body image, emerging sexuality, identity issues, but then again retakes to hormonal imbalances, stating premenstrual problems, pregnancies, postpartum depression, and menopause. So again, with the hormonal imbalances, right? On the other hand, some risk factors for depression and anxiety include life circumstances and culture. For example, as we mentioned before, unequal power and status. Women are much more likely to live in poverty, and this leads to a higher uncertainty about the future and decreased access to community and healthcare resources. On the other hand, we have work overload. Women often have to work outside the household and also maintain home responsibilities. Also, many women deal with being single parents, adding on more responsibilities. It is much more expected and normalized for women to be caretakers, not only of their children, but also of other family members. This leaves less time to prioritize themselves and their mental health. And finally, we can talk about sexual and physical abuse once again. Women who were emotionally and or physically and or sexually abused are more likely to experience depression than those who were not abused. And women are more likely than men to experience abuse. Continuing with the relationship between gender-based violence, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some statistics. According to the Mental Health Foundation in the UK, listen to this, 30 to 60% of women with a mental health diagnosis also have experienced domestic violence. 30 to 60%. Those were only the reported cases. According, on the other hand, and in a comparative, to the Canadian Women Foundation, risk for depression, PTSD, which I found had higher numbers in women than in men, contrary to what I believed, risk for depression, PTSD, or becoming suicidal was 1 to 5 times higher in women who experience violence. 1 to 5 times higher. They also found that 50% of women have experienced violence, that have experienced or reported experiencing violence, have also a mental health diagnosis. So here is when violence becomes a risk factor for mental health diagnosis in women. In the same study, 44% of women in Canada had experienced violence, at least one incident of physical or sexual abuse since the age of 15. In comparison to that, near 5 million women in Mexico were victims of sexual crimes during the second semester of 2021. Again, those were only the reported cases. 5 million in one semester. In Mexico, domestic violence against women has increased by 60% since the COVID pandemic. So now we have stated that violence in households leads to isolation, substance abuse, anxiety, depression, and suicide ideation in women. In my personal practice, I see this every day. Most of my patients are women who have either an anxiety disorder or a depression diagnosis, and also have experienced some sort of psychological and or physical and or sexual forms of violence. This is very important, and I want to make much emphasis in this. There is a bidirectional effect with women who have experienced abuse or violence because they are at greater risk for mental distress. And at the same time, mental distress makes them more vulnerable to having towards abuse. It's interesting because many studies have been made about the relationship between gender-based violence and mental health and the prevalence of mental health problems. And they found out that women who experience one form of gender-based violence, which Fernanda stated some of them, tend to experience more forms of gender-based violence in the course of their lives. Women who have both reported gender-based violence and health issues and mental health issues report to have also higher levels of severity, comorbidity with mental health disorders, increased rate of physical disorders, impaired quality of life, suicide attempts, more rates in mood, anxiety, substance abuse disorders. So there's a very clear relationship between the both of them. And my final point between stating those relationships is that survivors of violence who experience mental health concerns may be less likely, and you said this, Fernanda, may be less likely to report violence or their concerns about their mental health, as their mental health is often used to discredit their experience or blame them for what happened. So to summarize everything and to answer the question to what to do or start to work on doing, many people ask how can women get out of abusive relationship, as you previously stated. And I think in order to break free from an abusive situation, we first need to understand it. We first need to understand where it comes from, talking from a systematic perspective. We need to understand why it continues to be a cycle, to understand its repercussions on mental health. And we also need to acknowledge this bidirectional cycle between gender-based violence and mental health, not only for women, but also in men. And since gender-based violence is something that affects women, but also relates to men and everyone as a society, we need to create awareness to understand the role of systematic violence on mental health, not only in women, but also in men. Awareness to help understand and identify how gender-based violence plays a crucial role and serves as a risk factor for mental health diagnosis. Psychoeducation in mental health to help identify risk factors like biological, hereditary, social, etc., and learning how to identify and approach early symptoms for early intervention. Psychoeducation in understanding how mental health issues, anxiety, and depression have different symptomatology in men versus women, and understanding these differences can help people with early detection. Access to clinical psychotherapy or counseling with gender perspective to have a more profound understanding of how systemic violence, as you mentioned, and the factors surrounding it, and the repercussion it has on our society's mental health. And finally, access to programs and counseling that understands why women and men need different approaches and intervention for their mental health. I think that pretty much summarizes my perspective between women, men's mental health, and the role of how systemic violence and gender-based violence influence both of them and everyone as a society.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you so much. And I think in conclusion, as psychologists, we can say that our role is addressing these systemic issues contributing in gender equality, to eliminate violence, discrimination, all these societal norms that are limiting our great self, our development in society in a healthy, right, and positive way. And I think something is getting into other spaces as mental health professionals. In these last few months, I've been getting into understanding policy making and advocacy groups. And I think our perspective and our understanding of these systematic issues is very important when we make policy, when we make changes in systemic institutions, right? When we talk about a law, when we talk about health, we need to have this psychological or human perspective to understand how these policies, these programs, these forms of education, even in education, right? We need to be a part, so we can make a change, right? From the system to the people. And I think for everyone who is watching, who is into policy making, who is into is in advocacy groups, or has a role in real systematic changes in their own society, in their own communities, my invitation is to make mental health and gender and all these different specialists in different types of violence, psychologists or whatever their profession is, social workers, make them a part of those programs, or make them a part in the development of those programs, and also in the implementation of those programs. I think that is what I can leave today, because we as professionals, we can talk in social media, we can talk with our communities, we can talk in one-on-one with our clients, we can talk with our groups, but we need to be a part of the bigger change. That's what I can conclude about all of today's subject, because they are having an impact today in how we live as a society, in our rates in health, in our rates in mental health, in our rates in eliminating violence. So thank you so much. I think it's so important what you both had to offer today. Thank you so much, Alicia, for the invitation. I don't know if there's any questions or something else, but I think that's all from our part.
I said in the beginning of the session only, like, this is something very interesting to sort of have a perspective about. And having these conversations every day is also something which is important, because we tend to lose track, ki why is something happening to, I mean, why is this person in distress, and how intersectional this entire issue could be. Not just because it cannot be seen in a very unidimensional lens. There might be various dimensions to why somebody is feeling a particular feeling. And I think over here I have seen, at least in my close circle, or personally people around me, this is a concern that they have also expressed with me, actually, that when we this unfortunately happens when people also seek help, that because sometimes things are viewed in very conventional and traditional ways. So a certain angle of gender, or an angle of race, or an angle of ethnicity gets completely erased from their narrative. I mean, if they try to express that, that is not considered as something which is important. It is sidelined as a trivial issue. But how it affects somebody so deeply. I mean, right before your session, I was having a conversation with people who are natives from India but are now settled abroad. And the conversations that, I mean, they were expressing their experiences as, people living abroad but from a very different country. So they said a lot of things, like how as kids they were sort of made to feel as others, like you don't belong. I mean, not very directly, but subconsciously, when you're in a place where everybody else is from that place except for you, somehow you are made aware that you really don't belong here. And I wanted to our conversation sort of did not get completed, but I personally wanted to know from them that as kids, how would you want somebody else to explain that to you, what is happening to you? Because it's very important that we don't forget that kids are, obviously they are very very small, they are young people, but what you tell them affects them even in a bigger scale than we could imagine. I mean, if somebody is doing something wrong, for example, right now for me, my priority would be, as a kid, as a 5-year-old, my priority might seem like a very trivial thing to an adult, but the way that should be communicated to the kid is something which is very important. Otherwise, that leaves a lifelong impression on them, which I think what I was gathering from the conversation with the people before you is that something which seemed so trivial and which seems like a laughing issue as a 3-year-old, it actually carries on with you and leaves an imprint on your brain, and it affects you so deeply. So I mean, I could keep talking about this long and for a very long time, because I have personally struggled with this a lot. And I am glad that I have found a space to discuss this with my close people, the people I have sought help from. And I'm glad that I am able to do this. But yes, I want that there are people like you who are bringing this discussion in an everyday forum, in a summit like this. You chose to talk about this. We generally tend to speak about global trends, what is happening in the international markets, etc., etc., and this gets sidelined. This does not get expressed so deeply, and I'm really grateful that you chose to do this with us. And yes, this hits home. Thank you so much for discussing this. And I'm sorry, there are I don't see any questions because it's midnight over here, so I think people are not very active. But I'm very sure that once I share this recording with people, everybody will be able to resonate with this. I was getting thumbs ups and claps in between when you guys were speaking, so I did not interrupt. But I'm sure that many more people like me at least would resonate with this. And I think I really wish that people look at everything related to gender from a psychological perspective and how it might affect somebody so deeply. And thank you for taking time out and discussing this so comprehensively with us. Like I said, this is the end of the day session for me, so it's a good thing to end the day with, to sort of be at peace with something, some reaffirmations from your end. So thanks a lot. I have